Okay, so we'll make a start. Welcome everybody. My name's Caroline Hodgson and I'm the current president of the Bradford Textile Society. Before we start, I'd just like to mention our 2022 design competition. Entries will be submitted once again digitally, and we'll be receiving those from the 1st of April. The deadline for submissions is Friday, the 21st of May. Details are all on the website, and you can contact Sue, the BTS secretary. Her details are on the website, and she'll be sending information to tutors with any updates. One other point is if you are wanting to work with merino wool, Sue does have a list of merino wool suppliers, so please do get in touch. So tonight is the last talk of the season, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's talk in conjunction with the Worshipful Company of Woolmen. And on International Women's Day, it feels very appropriate that we should be welcoming Lesley Prior, wool grower and owner of Tellenby Merino Stud, a well-respected woman in the merino international community. We're also very grateful to Peter Ackroyd MBE, past president of the Bradford Textile Society, chief operating officer for the Campaign for Wool, and global strategic advisor to the Woolmark Company. And Peter is going to lead the conversation this evening and questions. So, as I mentioned, please would you post questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, and that will enable Peter to put these to Lesley at the end of the talk. So I'm going to hand over to Sir David Wootton, current Master of the Woolmen, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud to be a member of the Bradford Textile Society, having been born and brought up in Bradford. And I applaud the work that the BTS and you as President, Caroline, are doing. I am the master of the Worshipful Company of Woolmen, one of the City of London livery companies. There are about a dozen livery companies which focus on textiles, but we are the only one to focus entirely on a single fibre and the virtues and qualities of wool. And I'm delighted to say that Caroline and indeed Peter, you are also members of the Woolmen's Company. We're interested in the entire journey of wool, from wool on the hoof, shearing, handling, processing, making into product application use, end of use, disposal and recycling. We're interested in sustainability. We're interested in education and training, and are this year organising in partnership with British Wool a junior shearing competition at major agricultural shows around the country. We're interested in new applications and uses. We're interested in ways of creating demand for wool and working with other organisations to that end. And we're interested in what happens at the sheep end of this, looking at ways of greater yield, bringing about greater yield, better quality and greater fineness, which is why we're very interested in what Lesley Prior is doing, and why we and the Worshipful Company of Woolmen are delighted to be bringing about this event in conjunction with the Bradford Textile Society. So, President, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and giving the woman the opportunity to be involved in this. And I'll now move on to one of our other members of the Woolmen, Peter Ackroyd. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed. Good. Well, President Master, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Lesley later on this evening, but I thought I'd just give you a very brief outline of what the situation is currently like in the wool textile industry. We have had some difficult times. COVID has not been kind to fashion in particular. COVID hasn't been kind to industrial textiles, furnishings for the business sector, for hotels, for cruise ships, for airlines, etc. Of course, they haven't been moving, but I think things are moving better. Things are, there is more optimism, and one hopes that this isn't destroyed or derailed by what's happening currently in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, because let's not forget the importance of that part of the world for textile supply. Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, and the ex-Yugoslavia. They all play a key role in the European and North American supply chain, from greasy wool to fine gauge knitwear. We are living in a truly global business. I think I spoke to the Society a couple of years ago when I reported that the 93% of clothing bought in the United Kingdom is imported. In Germany, it's 92%, in Japan, around 90%, France, around 88%, and the USA, about 94%. There are massive flows of fabric and garments throughout the European Union, for example, and quite interesting to note that the EU member states imported clothing worth 154 billion euros, just over half of which came from outside the EU. And it's no surprise that China accounted for 29% at 23 billion euros, Bangladesh 19% at 15 billion euros, and perhaps more interestingly, Turkey 11% at 9 billion euros. You know, I'm convinced that current retailers would be more relaxed if wool finished goods came from Turkish sources rather than elsewhere, not just for geopolitical reasons, but purely for proximity of supply. As Lesley will tell you, the current name of the game is not only lower carbon footprint, but in a world emerging from COVID, less congested supply chains. Supply chains are clogged up. It's difficult to get things from the Southern Hemisphere. People are quoting somewhere between 6 months, 4 months, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, depending from where, for wool to come from the Antipodes. And mills in this area and in Italy are quoting 20 weeks for delivery, which is in many ways a potential disaster that risks missing the season in a time so sensitive to the industry. China is a massive example of how one nation has concentrated the premium and the middle market primary processing of the wool industry. 80% of Australian wool goes through China for washing, for scouring, and for combing. It's the same from South America. It's the same from New Zealand, and a lot of wool from the United Kingdom actually ends up in China for primary processing. The situation at the moment is slightly encouraging. I wrote recently that the global mid-micron worsted weaving sector was in the doldrums, with several key formal markets being static. People are not wearing suits, people are not wearing jackets. Sales of formal wear plummeted mid-COVID by up to -70%. I think I'm prepared now to modify my remarks as the industry begins to restock, albeit from a very low base. The Woolmark licensee weavers that I work closely with were seeing a drop in business of 60–70%, totally unsustainable. But things are beginning to improve. One area of good news is in the very, very fine micron sector, and if you follow the wool prices, you'll notice that fine micron wool, such as Lesley produces, is fetching a decent price, and this is in tandem with the extraordinary rise in sales and profits of the luxury sector. Burberry, LVMH, Kering, Hermes, Chanel, Prada, and several more are making a fortune, and the UK and Italian Woolmark spinners and weavers are benefiting accordingly. This has in turn encouraged a strong performance in the bespoke made-to-measure business, which is doing particularly well in China, USA, Japan, and gradually here in Europe. Knitwear in all gauges continues to outstrip even the most optimistic of predictions, with key spinners across the manufacturing spectrum reporting business well exceeding 2019 levels, which is most encouraging. A strong knitwear market encourages semi-casual and casual woven woolen business, and vertical woolen mills, some of which are around here in Yorkshire, are benefiting accordingly, and currently working well above 2019 levels. Traditional sports jackets, casual jackets, men's, women's layered wear, quirky coats, accessories such as stoles, ponchos and scarves, and very odd forms of headgear all feature prominently this winter season. Woolen mills are also in the advantageous position of being or benefiting from the boom in the interior textile sector. The home sector has been working particularly well during COVID. We're now seeing the other sectors of transport and hotels and offices coming back online. Fine count spinners are reporting particularly buoyant activity in the outdoors and next to skin market, which I think Lesley will talk about in her presentation. It's an area where pioneer research has been carried out by the Woolmark Company. One caveat, ladies and gentlemen, is that wool isn't cheap. And if we're to expand our market share beyond the well-heeled urban elite who, dare I say, winter in St. Moritz and summer in Saint-Tropez, we need to convince less affluent consumers that wool is not only an ideal, breathable, firmly well-managed option, its longevity makes it a far more economical purchase with a solid return on capital invested. And it's vastly superior to Supima cotton and, of course, polyester. The environmental footprint of wool is particularly important. But all in all, I think things are improving. I better not mention names, and Lesley and I are quite careful when we mention names because there's a sort of a bit of a Hippocratic oath among suppliers not to talk about their customers, just as doctors don't talk about their patients. But I can say that one mill, not terribly far away from where we are now, was suffering particularly badly during the depths of the pandemic and cut back production to 8,000 meters a week. As of last week, we're looking, the mill is looking to be back at between 18 to 20,000 a week. So on that sort of slightly optimistic, can I hand over to Lesley, who will talk about bringing home Merino? Well, she'll give us Lesley will give us a short introduction to Tellenby and then talk about how she's bringing Merino home to the UK.
Oh, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to President and to Sir David, the Master. Yes, I'm Lesley Prior, and I run Tellenby Merino, which is a merino sheep breeding unit down in Devon in southwest England. And I'm here this evening to talk about what we have done and how we have brought Merino home. So I'm going to share my screen now. And away we go, hopefully. Right, there we are. Okay, so I've called this talk Bringing Merino Home. And what do I actually mean by that? I mean, surely merinos are Australian, aren't they? But Australia actually doesn't have any sheep. All breeds of sheep were taken there by the British from the earliest days of the colony. We think merino actually originated in North Africa, and then it moved into Spain and Portugal, probably courtesy of the Romans. And from the 18th century, they spread throughout Northern Europe. By the time the first fleet left these shores in 1787, bound for Botany Bay, merinos were well established in most European countries. And that's a slide just showing, on the left there, you've got a German merino from the 1860s, and then a wonderful piece of art, and then on the right, an English merino group. Our textile industry had developed using our native breeds of sheep, and we imported fine merino wool from France and Spain. But then came the French Revolution, which seriously disrupted our supply chain. So in response, King George III imported the first merinos from Spain to England. And when the Peninsular War began in 1807 and cut off our supply entirely, homegrown merino became very precious indeed. They thrived in many places, including here in Devon. And we were so good at growing them that we exported merino sheep to Australia for over 100 years. Merino was well and truly at home in England. This handsome ram, photographed in 1860, was actually born and bred in Essex, and actually himself went out to Australia. So what happened to English merino? Why did it disappear? Well, the early sheep were very small and they were very much wool specialists, and they were certainly not meat animals. And our fast-growing industrial cities needed feeding. At the same time, our new Australian colony needed a non-perishable export, and they had plenty of land and cheap labour, so began growing the fine wool for us while we concentrated on meat. So by the end of the 19th century, the merino industry here had gone, although it persisted in Europe largely because we had a monopoly on Australian wool and Europeans had no choice but to grow their own. There is still a merino industry in Europe, but it's hugely variable in type and quality. It's very much artisan-based, small flocks selling to local wool merchants and often concentrating on meat, not wool quality. Merinos can also be milked, and some countries specialise actually in making merino cheese, notably Hungary and Spain. So Australia is not the origin of merino, but it is definitely the home of the modern merino. They took up the challenge of making something of those rather unpromising Spanish sheep, and over 200 years developed it into a very diverse animal. Merino today is always characterized by its very fine wool, but varies enormously in size, shape, wool type, and potential for meat. Australian genetics are found all over the world in many different environments, from Patagonia and Uruguay to Ukraine and Russia, and even northern India. So why is merino wool so special? It's the finest of all wools, roughly 11 to 23 micron, depending on type of sheep. And for comparison, an average British wool is about 32 micron and a human hair around 90. It's used in the finest suitings, next to skin wear, very fine knitwear, and increasingly in technical outdoor clothing, where its resilience, breathability, and moisture wicking qualities are especially valued. So if we grew it once, can we do it again and bring merino back to the UK? Particularly now there's such demand for provenance and accountability. Can we really grow top quality merino here? Well, I thought it was worth trying when in 2004, I was offered the chance to buy some merino type sheep from a failed government funded project. They were small, unproductive, and with poor quality wool, completely uncommercial, although I didn't really understand that at the time. There was no expertise to call on and no interest in helping me either. I was told regularly by people in British farming that you can't grow merino in the UK and that I was very stupid to even try. It was a pretty dark time for me, but having bought them, I was stuck. I worked alone for 6 years, mostly on gut feeling, and made some progress. Then in 2010, I was asked by Australian Wool Innovation to represent them at the launch event of the Campaign for Wool in London. I was absolutely astonished. For sure, the sheep were much better. They were bigger, they had more wool of consistent quality, and I'd just sold my crop to my first commercial buyer. But I knew I still had a very long way to go. AWI were there on the day, and I talked to real merino people for the first time. Wal Merriman, shown here, one of the best merino breeders in Australia, went through my sheep with great care, and I learned more from him in an hour than I had in 6 years on my own. They recognised my passion, and the result was the doors were opened to me for whatever help and support I needed from Australia, support which continues to this day. Information, advice, contacts, I just have to ask. We had to learn how to assess, class, and measure our existing animals and their wool to understand what we needed. Only then were we able to set goals and have some chance of achieving them. We made a series of visits to some of the best studs and institutions in Australia to learn. And during COVID, we've continued to learn via the internet. Colleagues and friends in Australia are never far away, despite the distance. And I must say that we've booked flights for September for our next round of live education. We needed new genetics. That was the priority. Live animal imports from Australia are banned, so we had to use artificial breeding. It took 2 years of planning, but we made our first import of superfine merino genetics in 2012. And 10 years on, we're expert at sourcing the right bloodlines and using them correctly. I've built a great team around us to help with this incredibly complex task. It's all been self-financed, and it remains a private research and development project. And this is where we are today. We have big, productive sheep with bright white wool, very commercial. All the original sheep have long gone, and we now run purely on Australian genetics. If ever I feel uncertain about the progress I've made, I look at this: 2004 wool on the left and 2021 wool on the right. It says it all. But things never stand still. Recently, these South Australian merinos were gifted to us by Cambridge University. They had been imported directly from Adelaide for medical research under special Home Office licence, as live imports are banned. And they spent 4 years in Cambridge before coming to me with Home Office permission, but under very, very strict rules. They are a unique and very precious genetic resource. South Australian merinos have a larger frame and higher yield of slightly broader or coarser wool than our main flock. In other words, they're sort of typical Marks and Spencer's merino knitwear. But they can also produce a good quality meat lamb. Our superfines are wool specialists. Our South Australians are much more of a dual purpose sheep. So how do we manage these two types of merino in our conditions? English farmers often ask this. They can't understand how merinos survive our damp climate. But I've never been asked this by an Australian. They know if you get the genetics right, merino will work anywhere. We manage them the same as any other sheep, always remembering that wool is our crop and at certain times needs extra protection from severe weather. Autumn is traditionally the start of the sheep year. Rams and ewes are put together. We don't just open the gate, let the boys run in with the girls. It's all planned very carefully. And we also carry out our artificial breeding program in autumn. Winter means a period of housing. The sheep are generally in long wool in late winter, so we do need to take special care at this particular time to avoid heavy, prolonged rain. The sheep don't mind, but it can affect wool quality when it's close to maximum length. Exactly the same problems occur in Australia during periods of heavy rain. New South Wales has just experienced one of the wettest summers on record, and for some, that has meant damage to their wool crop. Our sheep do go out whenever it's dry enough. Snow doesn't bother them. They have woolly jumpers on after all. Spring is lambing time. All lambs are born inside to give maximum care and protection from predators. It's very hard work, but I never get tired of seeing new life, especially when you've planned that birth, sometimes for years. Summer is a time for exploring, playing, and learning to be a sheep, and a time for the ewes to rebuild strengths once the lambs are eating grass, before the whole cycle begins again in the autumn. So how and when do we harvest the wool? Lambs are shorn at 12 months, but adults are shorn according to wool length, so sometimes less than a year. We aim for around 80 to 90 mil to ensure versatility for woolen or worsted spinning. Each fleece is classed by an Australian classer, which, as far as I'm concerned, is essential to give us credibility and also to get the very best from our wool clip. The standards are very high. Our main wool is superfine, which is the bottom of the two samples here. It's around 16.5 to 17.5 micron. In Bradford count, and Pete will have to correct me, I think that's 120s upwards. Our South Australian flock is only small at the moment. This is the top sample we're talking about here, but numbers will build up gradually, and we hope before too long to have a good offering of 19 to 22 micron wool to sit alongside the superfine. And in Bradford count, I think that's 64s to 70s, 80s, thereabouts. But producing quality wool is only half the story these days. Animal welfare and environmental care concerns buyers just as much. We believe it's a privilege to share the lives of our animals and use the fibres they produce. It's our duty to treat them with respect and kindness at all times. But how do we prove we do that? Now, apologies for the word heavy slide here, but the details are important. Some of you will have heard of the 5 freedoms, but we also believe in and implement the 5 opportunities on the right-hand side. Working with universities and vets, we've spent the last 2 years trying to define what we do here and put it into an auditable format. It's called positive welfare. So what does this mean in practical terms? It's helping the sheep to enjoy life, maximising choice, freedom, and giving them confidence. You've seen pictures of me with the sheep, and this slide is an example of positive experiences with other animals. Our working collies, when off duty, will lie in the sun with the sheep and generally chill. There's absolutely no fear here, just mutual respect and even curiosity. And this is positive welfare in action. Our protocol is a substitute for schemes like the Responsible Wool Standard, which are not available in Europe, and they don't measure positive welfare. This is a comparison between RWS and us. Both have merits, but ours is designed to enhance the life of sheep, while RWS is designed to satisfy retailers. But to truly care for sheep, you also have to care for their environment. One grows from the other, quite literally. We have traditional pastures here. Less intensive grassland suits merinos very well and is better for the wool. Some areas are very special indeed and will be harvested for seed this year by Devon Wildlife Trust to reseed other farms nearby. 30% of our farm is ancient woodland, here since the Ice Age, a beautiful living landscape, but it doesn't look after itself. Diseases like ash dieback and storms mean we have to restore and replace what we can all the time, but we do have plenty of firewood. The biodiversity here is the result of over 1,000 years of farming with animals. Remove the livestock and so much would disappear. So we try hard to maintain and enhance it, and above all, do no harm. But how do we prove this? Buyers want tick box schemes for welfare, but now they also want proof that you farm under one or more of these headings. But what do they really mean? Without agreed standard definitions, in my view, very little. The tools used to assess them are not standardized either. So we have the unmeasurable being accounted for by the unmeasured, which is not always a good foundation on which to build. We've done what we can, as shown here. By the way, none of the carbon accounting tools I could find account for carbon sequestration in wool. Yet according to IWTO data, 1 kilogram of clean wool sequesters 1.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, and it grows anew each year. This is a massive oversight in my view, and they have been told, and they will remedy it eventually. But apparently it's not a priority. My definition of truly sustainable farming is very simple. Only take out what you can put back and make sure you really do put it back. Sheep fit very well into this system. They convert the unusable into the usable, and they recycle most of the agents they use to do it. So we've proved the concept, we've brought Merino home, and we know there's demand for our wool. We have absolutely no difficulty in selling it. People just want more than I can produce at the moment. People want quality, but they also want direct engagement with the grower and a real feel for the place the wool is grown. Merino produced here can deliver both. So is there an opportunity for others to do the same? Yes, of course there is. In some ways, there's never been a better time to try something different in the UK, but farmers are notoriously wary of the new, even when, as in this case, it isn't actually new. As a result, although we sell very few, most have actually gone to Europe, where we've been exporting since 2017. Growers there want Australian genetics, but they also want to know they will work in their conditions, and not all bloodlines will. By buying from us, they know we have tested them. If they thrive here, they will do well anywhere in Europe. So do we have a future? We should have, but I don't know. There is growing demand for the wool, but Brexit stopped my export trade in January 21 by removing all border control posts over the channel for live animals. It's also made getting shearers almost impossible. And the changes to farming introduced by our government, plus a hostile public attitude towards livestock, are making retirement very appealing. It's certain we have a wonderful resource here, but limited time remaining to continue it or to find it a new home. So do we have a future? Well, ask me again in another year. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy now to answer any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go. Peter, over to you.
Hello, Lesley. You ended on a rather sort of ominous note, saying that retirement is very appealing.
Yes.
Do you think Brexit has something to do with that?
Yes, I mean, it really has. It has made life very, very difficult for me personally and for many other people in the industry. Obviously, I'm a pedigree breeder, and some of our income was coming from exporting pedigree livestock, not all of it by any means. And we've always made sure that we actually make the bulk of our money from what the sheep grow on their backs, because that is very important to me. But nonetheless, a sizable amount of the income that we would have had last year disappeared entirely. And it's also from the shearing point of view, Eastern European migrants would come over here in the summer season and work in our agricultural industry, which meant that our shearers were free to spend the summer shearing. My particular shearer, for example, over the last few months and going forward into the summer, is going to be doing some of the contracting work that those Eastern European workers would have done. So he is not available for shearing. And therefore, it's reducing the pool of people who would normally be shearing and making life very difficult for us. So yes, Brexit's had a major impact.
It's not just on the primary processing, and not just on the farming side of the business. You will find that cloth manufacturers in the north of England are having massive difficulties getting their samples and their cut lengths to customers in Europe at a time when the European luxury business is booming. There's a lot of, you talked a lot about land management and welfare. Do you think that land management and carbon sequestration is becoming more important than animal welfare at the moment?
I don't think that it's more important. I think it's equally important, Peter, because if you think about it, you have to have fit and healthy sheep in order for them to make best use of the land. If you think about it logically, for example, a sick sheep or a sheep that's underperforming is actually going to be using more resources and will require treatment, might require antibiotics and things to actually just keep it healthy and keep it alive. So keeping well healthy animals is much better always. So welfare and land management go together. Carbon sequestration, we're incredibly fortunate in Europe in that our general conditions are that we have really good and abundant grass growth. So grass is one of the very best carbon sinks that you can possibly have. So if you have year-round pasture cover, as we do in our Northern European countries, then we're already onto a winner. And what is the best animal for eating grass? Well, yes, okay, cattle. Let's move the whole question of cattle to one side. But sheep actually are phenomenal users of that grass, which we couldn't use in any other way. So it's a win-win situation, really.
So the argument is George Monbiot versus Alan Savory. I mean, Alan Savory will tell you what he's done in Zimbabwe and in North America to regenerate the soil and to regenerate parts of the country. And Monbiot wants to get rid of all the sheep. I had an argument recently with a vegan, or shall we say a frank exchange of views. And I had to inform the person that there were 300 million families in Africa and the Middle East that depend on livestock for their sole source of income, you know, for food, for milk, for cheese, for skins, for wool, etc. And a lot of people are sort of sitting in these sort of their homes in smart parts of New York, London, Paris, making pronouncements about how you cannot use animals for this, that, and the other. So I'm glad I'm glad the science is there. And that
I think so, definitely. And I made the point in the presentation that if you take livestock away, we would actually lose biodiversity on our farm. If you allowed it to go back to woodland and scrub, which is perhaps what the native landscape would be in Devon, we'd lose phenomenal amounts of very rare and precious plants, butterflies, insects, birds, which have actually existed only because of livestock farming. So yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship. The soil and sheep go together.
We're very interested to hear, Lesley, the type of brands that you're dealing with, and I know that there's this sort of Hippocratic oath that one doesn't talk about them, but I think there is a tendency nowadays to for brands to want to be a bit more transparent about their supply chain. Can you say a bit about the brands that are buying Tellenby and
yes, we've
their collections?
Yes, I mean, since we started, we've had a very strong relationship with Finisterre, who are, as you probably know, well, I'm sure you know, Peter, is an outdoor leisure wear brand. And they have so far bought our wool every year and have been incredibly supportive. And as from last year, we have also been selling our less desirable parts of the wool, the non-fleece parts of the wool. I would say not less desirable, but the short bits, the sort of stubbly bits, the bits you take off the top of the head, the belly pieces, things like that, which in Australia are regularly sold through the auction system. But over here, I've never had a market for until I was contacted by Hainsworths of Yorkshire, who have been phenomenally supportive and helpful in exactly the same way that Finisterre have been. And we have sold some of our non-fleece wools to them, and they're very, very pleased to be using it. So for me, that's wonderful, because it means even my waste, if you like, has been able to be sold, which is great. So there's no waste at all. Basically, what comes off the back of the sheep, every scrap of it is now used, which is great.
Lesley, are you the only merino producer in this country? Or
there are several people who are producing merino, but not Australian merino. Put it that way. Yeah.
You say you're the only farm with Australian bloodlines.
Australian genetics. Yeah.
Anybody else thinking of doing it in Europe?
Yes, there's several people in Europe now, because we're exporting over there. We've got a very good, a strong flock growing in Switzerland, which we helped establish. There's a very good small flock in Romania developing. And Australian genetics have appeared in various places in Europe in the past and are still there, but they're under risk and under threat of diluting through poor breeding control very often. And that's often a problem. You know, people don't keep tabs of what they've got and don't manage the breeding carefully. But yes, there are some Australian merinos in Europe.
There's several questions coming in. One from Phil Stocker, who says, thank you very much for the presentation. Over the centuries, farmers have shown they are adaptable and innovative. What would it need for the merino to grow here in the UK? Sort of a segue to my question there.
I think we need people to be a little more open-minded. Younger farmers, on the whole, are more prepared to consider this, but unfortunately in this country, because of the way the farming industry is structured, too often the younger farmers are hamstrung by the fact that it's dad or grandpa that actually holds the purse strings. So they frequently can't do anything about it, even though they would like to innovate. And I'm sure Phil knows that as well as I do. There are one or two, and we are actually now selling to a couple of people in this country who have made the leap of faith, if you like, and are beginning to see this as a way forward. So I'm not entirely without hope, but making that step is dependent on having some money behind them to do it. And also gaining sufficient knowledge. You know, it's taken me a long time to get where I am from the knowledge point of view. So that needs help and support to actually pass that on.
And Phil Stocker adds that let's not forget that much of Britain's biodiversity is based around, dependent on farming and woodland activity. Yeah,
exactly.
Point
Absolutely.
Made.
Yes, which is what I was saying earlier. Yes.
We have a question from Janet Wilson asking, have you ever had students from the agricultural colleges visit your farm to see what you're doing? I think you have, haven't you?
I have.
But Janet thinks they would be very inspired by it.
Yes, I have had in the past, less so recently. Funnily enough, I get more fashion students than agricultural students. But yes, we do. We have a few from the local area, but it is certainly less common than the fashion students.
David Wotton's asking, Lesley, you said that you could sell more than you can produce. who and where are your customers? You partly answered that, but what
Yes.
types of business are they? What products does your wool go into? And I think it's probably next to skin, is it?
Yes, yes, luxury next to skin, anything that Australian superfine would go in, and people just like the idea of buying superfine grown here rather than buying superfine from Australia for all sorts of reasons.
There's a question from Janet Prescott, which is quite involved, so I'll read it carefully. Janet is asking, how worried are you by the fast-paced current moves on buying up farms with government subsidised incentives for acres of unicultural woodland, then selling the carbon capture on? Stories of whole farms in Wales being bought by this initiative, many of them ancient sheep farms, will change the nature of farming. Any comment on that?
Yes, I know where you're coming from, Janet. I was listening to a piece on the radio, Radio 4's Costing the Earth today on that very topic. At the moment, my understanding is that most of those are the upland sheep areas where there is more pressure on making a living on the sheep farms. It is a worry. Because it changes the cultural landscape. You know, if farmers are not farming, then the whole of the community will disappear because there's no kids to go to the local schools, no people to go and buy food from the local shops. They've all gone, and you're just left with a landscape of trees. But here in Devon, it's not yet too much of an issue. We have a lot of other land pressures. One of the bigger land pressures here, actually, for us is lifestyle buyers. People escaping from London and from the cities who come down and fancy buying up 150, 200 acres, and then they don't actually know what to do with it. They just buy a very nice posh house, and then they find they've got 150 acres or 200 acres of land, and what the hell are they going to do with it? That is more of a problem here. And they might end up going into trees as a way of using the land without actually having to look after it with animals. So yes, it's a concern. Definitely.
I remember in the dim distant 70s, buying trees was a tax break, if I remember correctly, which was
that's still the case. Yes,
a lot of folk did.
I think you'll find that there are questions being raised over the efficiency of this from the carbon point of view, and whether in fact we should be using productive land for growing trees, or whether or not we shouldn't be using brownfield sites instead. And concentrate on more peri-urban planting rather than completely rural and agricultural land.
Lesley, we have a question from Alexandra Wheatley, who is a sustainable knitwear designer planning on setting up her own circular luxury women's wear knitwear brand. She says she's very focused on biodegradable fibres and on animal-friendly sources, which is exactly what you do. Would you ever be open to physical visits to your farm, open to collaborative projects, one-to-one Zoom calls to discuss what you can offer? Alexander seems to be very passionate about using merino wool for its endless benefits. So may I ask, what is the lowest amount of yarn you can offer? Now, I think we've got to be careful here because Lesley is not providing yarn, Alexander, but I'll let you answer that, Lesley. You are providing fibre that has to be scoured and combed and spun. Yeah.
Yes, that's the point, Alexandra. It's not, I can't offer yarn. We don't offer yarn. The way we work is that we work with a company who wants to take the product from the back of the sheep and then get it processed, basically. And that's the way it works. And there are minimum quantities involved for this, you know, and it's very difficult to supply small amounts. And certainly you couldn't supply small amounts of multiple colours or multiple wool counts. It's quite complex. So while I'm very happy to talk about it, we don't actually supply yarn, but we can certainly talk about the concepts.
Have you ever been tempted to put a few spinning wheels in that lovely home of yours in Columbia?
No, actually, but having said that, Peter, I did, in the very early days, I did ensure that I went and I learned how to spin and also how to hand weave. And I still have an 8-shaft loom, and I do have 3 different types of spinning wheels. And the reason for doing with that was so that I understood the process, the mechanical process. So when I actually went and visited a mill, I wasn't completely pig ignorant about what was going on.
I'm ashamed to admit, I learnt my spinning in a Courtaulds acrylic plant in Lille in northern France. Alexander did just added that she's very focused on sourcing locally from within the UK due to Brexit, and is keen for a lower carbon footprint. And I think what Alexander said is probably the name of the game at the moment. The question is, Lesley, will buyers from the better brands, will they be prepared to put their hand in their pocket and pay for this? It makes one wonder sometimes.
I think probably the answer is yes, because if you were buying from somebody like me, you're always going to be promoting a niche product, and it's going to be a niche within a niche. So they will probably accept the slightly higher price on the basis that it's actually going to be, it can command a higher price on the retail front. Certainly we've had no problem so far.
Karen Charlton's asking, do you supply your wool in smaller quantities to home spinners and weavers? Well, I think probably you've answered that when saying that most of what you produce is actually sold, and that is the story of the entire merino business. Everything that's produced in the merino growing countries, not just UK, but in South America, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, it is sold.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. No, we can't unfortunately produce enough at the moment to supply everybody who wants it, but we're working on it. I keep telling the sheep to hurry up and get on with the job.
Adrian Titley was saying, is part of the problem the general public being unaware of the benefits of local British wool merino products?
No, that's not a problem. My problem is just actually physical hooves on the ground, actually getting them to reproduce fast enough. Because if you concentrate, as I do, very much on doing this correctly and producing top quality all of the time, then you can't rush this. If you have 300 ewes, you're not going to want to necessarily have 300 ewes producing a lamb every year, because although they're all producing good wool, some of those ewes you might decide you don't want actually to continue their particular line for one reason or another. They're not producing quite what you want to go in the next direction for. So it's not a question of just putting every single sheep in lamb and actually getting a maximum number of lambs on the ground. When you're doing something like I'm doing, it's quality, not quantity, that matters.
Lesley, Peter Huller's asking a question about shearing. Do merino sheep require specialist shearing, or is it perfectly
they require a different approach to shearing. They take longer to shear. Superfine merino tend to have quite a thin skin. They can also have quite a lot of wrinkles, not as many as the conventional photographs you might see from, say, the 1920s, 1930s. A lot of the wrinkles have been bred out, but nonetheless, because of that, they require a lot more time and a lot more care and a slightly different approach. And the equipment that a shearer uses is slightly different. The combs and the cutters are slightly different from what you would use on a standard British breed. But that's all, really. So it's time, and that's reflected in the cost. We pay our shearers more than they would get paid for shearing a conventional British breed, because it takes them twice as long, at least.
A friend of mine in Australia was wanting to talk, possibly post-COVID, and I think you know him, Don McDonald, about could we arrange seasonal exchanges of shearers. What do you think about that one, Lesley?
Oh, I think that's great. And of course, it has been the case up until COVID that we did have many Kiwis and Australians coming over. And in fact, I've had Australian shearers on farm shearing my sheep, but that's all stopped, of course, because of COVID. So yes, please, Don, yes, please send somebody over, because I'd be first in the queue to have them on the farm.
Well, let me make that connection this evening, tomorrow morning, Australia time. Alexander Whitley just said thank you very much, but also, can you provide your main customers, who the main customers are for primary processing of the wool? I think we can take that on notice and let you have a few names of people within the supply chain here in the UK that can work with growers and work with I think that's quite easy. A more technical question from Stephen Hibbs, fellow woolman from North Yorkshire, who is a wool grower himself. What weight are your fleeces? Do you use a special feeding regime through the year? Do you ever get a coloured merino? Delighted and impressed by your positive welfare, which I fully support. Well, Stephen fully supports that. But basically, is there something special?
No. In fact, they need absolutely minimal feeding. I mean, we really don't overfeed them at all. They're basically just on grass silage. When they're not eating fresh grass during the winter, they're eating grass silage. And the only time we actually give them any supplement at all is in the 4 weeks before lambing. Beyond that, they don't get anything. They are very, very cheap to keep by comparison with meat sheep. So no, and coloured merino, no. If we had a coloured merino, we'd be horrified. Absolutely horrified. You certainly don't want any colour at all in merino. It's all white, pure white, no black need apply, because it just is bad news for processing.
Yeah, I remember lots of the mills were terrified of having mills are still terrified of contamination.
Exactly. Yes.
It's a major problem, and also contamination of wool coming in from Australia.
Yeah.
Lesley, we're getting towards the end of the evening. Thank you very much indeed for all the work you put into presenting a brilliant case for continuing to produce merino in this country. I don't see any more questions coming in from the floor. Yes, Caitlin Butler was asking, what are the most favoured attributes of merino? Well, natural, sustainable, biodegradable, renewable, but Lesley, what's your personal take?
Yes, I mean, take all that as read, because yes, it's very satisfying to produce a product which is just so perfect for the planet. It's good for us, and it's good for the planet. But actually, from a personal point of view, one of the most satisfying attributes is just putting your hands on that wool. It is just so soft, so silky, and just so special to bury your hands in really good superfine merino. So yes, there's lots of different attributes there, but I suppose that is for me, on a personal front, actually touching it. The touch factor is incredible. Beautiful stuff.
When I talk to when I talk to crossbred growers, not only here in UK but in Australia and New Zealand, they don't really get the price differential between merino and crossbred. Did you think there'll ever be a rapprochement between the two, and the crossbred prices will go up?
Well, I hope so, because I think there's a demand for all wool. I mean, we have to start using wool in general, not just merino. It's coming, it's getting there. I think there's a revival of interest in wool generally, thanks partly to the campaign for wool, but also people are beginning to see sense and realize that we have to use natural fibers to their fullest extent, rather than relying entirely on man-mades all the time. And we've only got to look at what's happening in Eastern Europe, unfortunately, to see how vulnerable we are. And we have to make far more of our own natural resources. And wool is just perfect for that. It just ticks all the boxes.
Yeah, it does indeed. Lesley, well, thank you very much indeed. Are there any more questions, ladies and gentlemen, from the floor? It's been a massive... yes, we've got one here. So Jonathan, hello, good evening. Lesley, lovely to hear your passion for your sheep coming through your talk. Clearly more UK production will be sold from what you say. I know the right genetics are important, but given the sheep, where in the UK would merino flocks do best and on what type of land?
They're not natural hill sheep, that's for sure. I wouldn't put them up on high hills, but anywhere that lowland sheep can grow in the UK, they should be okay. I mean, when you consider that my average rainfall over the last 10 years has been 1,000 mils. If they can survive and do well with me, then they ought to do well anywhere. Probably the very best place for them would be in East Anglia, where it's naturally a bit drier and the soils are lighter. So the eastern side of England, they should thrive and do very well. And there's a natural symbiosis there really with arable farming. There's a good opportunity to restore fertility to the soils on arable farms by having a sheep rotation in arable farming. So I do see quite a big opportunity for arable areas, particularly in the east of England. But apart from hill areas, they should do well anywhere.
Yeah. Joss from the Cloth Workers Company is asking about, can merino sheep thrive in cold and wet? And he said, apologies if you have covered this. I think you have adequately covered it, but it's quite interesting. When I used to talk to students in Australia about sheep, I would show a picture of a Farquharson picture of sheep coming home on a classic English or Scottish Christmas card in about -10, and then show a picture of Tom Utley, that Tom Utley painted, I think, called A Breakaway, of sheep leaving a mob in +42 degrees in New South Wales.
Yeah.
So I illustrate that you had a temperature differential of 52 degrees centigrade, and sheep were perfectly happy in both.
Yes, as I said in the presentation, the thing is the wool. The only thing you have to really consider is the stage of wool growth with merinos. The sheep themselves thrive and can do well practically anywhere in most conditions. It's the stage of wool growth that matters. So if you've got long wool and long periods of heavy rain, that can be bad news. But in shorter wool or relatively recently shorn, then they're absolutely fine. So it's the wool you have to protect.
Yeah, this leads into a further question from Phil Stocker. Do you find the sheep healthy? Are there any particular health challenges that would prevent more sheep farmers getting involved in merino?
One of the things I'm often asked, Phil, is about their feet, because there was a legend in the UK that you couldn't possibly keep merinos because they all had foot rot. That's complete rubbish. There is no problem. In fact, we here on the farm are foot rot free. We had a survey done here by Birmingham University, who went through every hoof on the farm, swabbed them all, and came up with the fact that we don't actually have foot rot here. That makes us one of, I think, only 2 farms in the country that don't have foot rot, and these are merinos. So, you know, it's not an automatic thing that you have a problem with feet. And from the rest of them, from the rest of the point of view of health, no, they're absolutely fine. They're relatively easy to keep.
Lesley, I'm charged by the President to ensure that we end promptly at 7:30. Just one very quick question from Josh Crick asking, do you think the Australian trade deal will impact the UK wool market? I don't think it probably will, but you may have another view.
Yeah, no, Josh, I really don't think so, because the Australian wool that comes into the UK is wool that we don't grow here, apart from myself. We're not growing that wool in this country, so it won't have an impact on wool. Meat, I think I'll have to defer to wiser heads than mine, and Phil Stocker may well be able to answer that more. But even still, I mean, the Australian sheep meat is quite different from our carcass formation, and therefore I think it's probably going to go into a different market. So probably not too bad, but we must just wait and see. The jury's out on that, on the meat side. But wool, no, don't see any impact at all.
Very briefly, Patricia Casey was asking, commercial as opposed to organic. What do you believe? What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sorry,
really.
commercial as opposed to organic. When you started off, given that you were brave enough to take on the merino sheep,
Yes.
Was that a consideration? I only ask regards sprays and scouring, although
I see. Right. So, well,
it's a processing question, basically. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. I mean, we do the absolute minimum. I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that it would cost me about £1,000 a year, I could actually be organic, because we don't use anything that isn't licensed to be used by an organic system, because you can use sprays and antibiotics and all other medication under an organic system if you have to. So we could be considered organic. So it's not either or. It's the system that we run. We're just not labelled organic.
I've got a little note on my wall in my desk, by my desk, Lesley, that says that Australia produces 350 million kilos of merino greasy, but they do regard you as being their standard bearer in the UK. And for the demand that Lesley creates with her merino, there is a massive amount of further demand that she creates for the brands that she works with. So, Lesley, thank you very much indeed. We first met, I think, on Savile Row in 2010, when you had your Exmoor horn and your merino sheep outside the great houses of Savile Row, who hopefully are getting back to more normal business. But thank you very much indeed. The farm is really worth visiting. It's a lovely part of Devon. But with that, I'll hand back to Caroline, who will. So I've got to turn off my camera and my microphone, and Caroline.
Well, Thank you. It's been a truly fascinating discussion, and thank you too for dispelling the myth that with tenacity and expertise, that it is possible to breed merino here in the UK. So on behalf of the Bradford Textile Society and the Worshipful Company of Woolmen, I'd like to thank you very much indeed, Lesley and Peter, for this evening's talk. And we'll be sending you a little token of our thanks from the Society. And also thank you to our attendees this evening and throughout the series. We've had some fantastic questions. It's been great to have such an engaged audience. So I'd just like to say thank you once again for this evening's talk and our last talk of the season.